Welcome to part 1 of sensory physiology. I'm Lieutenant Luke Scripture, call sign Double Tap. The terminal objective for this lecture is to describe the basic function of the 4 primary orientation senses, how they provide orientation information, and how illusions can affect these senses. Let's begin by a discussion of situational awareness. Can you define situational awareness? You may have your own definition, and I'm sure it's a good one. The NATOPS defines situational awareness as the degree of accuracy by which one's perception of the current environment mirrors reality. This is a pretty concise definition, and it brings in a couple points that I want you to pay attention to. One is the fact that there is a difference between how you perceive the environment and the real environment. There will always be a difference. And then the second part is, how accurate is your perception of that reality? Have you missed something important, or do you have something incorrect in your perception as it compares to reality? This alternate definition is from Dr. Micah Ensley, a former chief scientist of the Air Force, and she really wrote the book on situational awareness and human factors and a lot of other things that we use in our curricula. I'll let you read that definition, but I want you to pay attention to this idea of an internal mental model, something that you use each and every day to process and organize and ignore extraneous information while using the information that you need to make decisions. As long as that internal mental model takes everything into account that is important, and that model is accurate, we can use it to predict the results of potential actions and maintain awareness of what's going on. If that model is good, we have good situational awareness. If that model is flawed or incorrect, now we have problems. In 2014, the United States Naval Aviation had 162 physiological events. I won't go into great detail on what exactly a physiological event is, but we can see a breakdown here of what the causes of those physiological events were. About half of them are hypoxia. If you remember, 2014 was when there was a large spike in hypoxia or hypoxia-like events in aircraft, and this was a big concern and continues to be in naval aviation. You can see some other causes there as well: G-lock, fatigue, decompression sickness, but really I want you to pay attention to that red wedge. Spatial disorientation accounted for 24 of those 162 physiological events. Now that wedge only represents 15% of those physiological events. That's 15% of the problems that the Navy had with physiological episodes were due to spatial disorientation. Well, 15% isn't that much. So what's the problem? The problem is that spatial disorientation is preventable. Those aircrew have gauges in their aircraft that tell them about their position in space, the orientation of their aircraft, where they are on the planet. So they have the information available to maintain orientation, but for some reason they didn't or couldn't use it. Another reason for having this entire lecture about spatial disorientation is the fact that of those mishaps in 2014, and this applies to most years where these numbers are representative, there were 3 spatial disorientation class alpha mishaps. That particular year, that made it the #1 killer of aircrew. So even though they only account for a small portion of the events, the consequences of a spatial disorientation episode are often disastrous. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to be studying in this lecture. We're going to talk about what spatial disorientation is. We'll talk about the orientation senses. We'll discuss spatial disorientation countermeasures, and finally motion sickness. So what does spatial disorientation mean to you? You might have your own definition, not knowing which way is up, being confused about directions, and those are all true. The definition we're going to use for spatial disorientation is an erroneous sense of one's position and motion relative to the plane of the Earth's surface. Human beings are hardwired to reference our orientation based on the surface of the Earth. We're made to walk around on the surface of this planet. And while the Earth is spherical, no matter what you may have seen on YouTube, we can treat the plane of the Earth's surface as if it is flat, and that's how we orient ourselves. So there are 3 types of spatial disorientation. Type 1 is unrecognized. This is where you have that erroneous sense of orientation relative to the Earth's surface, but you don't know about it. Type 2 is recognized, so now you've realized that something is wrong. You may not know exactly what it is or how to fix it, but you realize that I feel this way, but I know that that's not right. And then finally, type 3 is incapacitating. This is a situation where you probably know that something is wrong, but you cannot take action to fix it. You are so overwhelmed by that disorientation that you simply cannot take corrective action. And something that's important to recognize with this discussion is that we're all going to begin a spatial disorientation episode in that unrecognized spatial disorientation. We're going to be disoriented, but we won't realize it. The goal is to recognize it and then take steps to reorient. So that transition from unrecognized to recognized is crucial in order to get out of that progression to either incapacitating or to just stay in unrecognized spatial disorientation until disaster strikes. So which one is the most dangerous? I think you probably have a pretty good idea. We'll discuss this more later in the lecture. Next, let's move on to the orientation senses. So I'm actually going to have you begin with a little demo right there at home. If you can, I'd like you to stand up and just face the computer. Stand there on your 2 feet. You're pretty stable, right? Now I'd like you to stand on 1 foot with your other leg held up in front of you with your upper leg parallel to the floor. And now reach out with your hands to the side and your palms facing upwards. So your arms should be out away from your body with your palms held up. And try to hold still in that position. It's a little more challenging, right? But you can do it. Now let's make it a little more complicated. Continue to hold that position, but tilt your head up to look at the ceiling. Now tilt your head down so that you're staring at the floor with your chin to your chest. Now bring your head back up to look at the ceiling. Now back down at the floor. Continue that motion and try to maintain your balance. I think you'll notice that it's become quite a bit more difficult. Finally, continuing to hold that position and continuing to move your head, I want you to close your eyes. Alright, did you fall down? I hope you didn't hurt yourself. Thank you for participating in that demonstration. I hope that you actually did it because you really can get a sense for how much more difficult a basic task like balancing is when we start taking away sensory input. So these are your 4 primary orientation senses. You have your visual system, the vestibular system, the proprioceptive system, and finally the auditory system. Now, do you think that each of these senses provides an equal amount of input to your brain? If you guess no, you're absolutely correct. The brain gives about 80% of its bandwidth to the visual system. We are visual creatures, and we get a massive amount of information for orientation through our eyes. The next largest section is 15% from the vestibular system, that inner ear, 5% from the proprioceptive, and finally 0% but helping information from our ears, from our auditory system. We'll discuss more of those other systems later, but let's move over to the visual system. Now, as I said, the strongest and usually the most reliable source of information we have for orientation comes from our eyes. Some basics of the anatomy of the eye here. You have the lens, the cornea. The light comes in through the cornea and the lens. It's focused onto the back of your eye where your retina is. We always draw these pictures where it's this point of light focused on the back of your eye, but really it's an image being projected onto the back of that eye, just like a projector on a movie screen. But we want it to be a nice, crisp, clear image. If you can't focus a crisp, clear image, that's why you might have to wear glasses or contact lenses or have had corrective surgery so that that image can be clear and crisp. Notice also the optic disc, which is where the optic nerve and blood vessels come into the back of the eye. We'll talk more about that later. Now you have two types of photoreceptor cells on the back of your eye. They're in your retina. About 7 million of those photoreceptor cells are cone cells, and that's divided among three different types: red, blue, and green. Now these cells are responsible for color vision. You have three types because that's all your brain needs in order to interpret the light coming in and to perceive the full spectrum of color. This is why if you were to get really close to your computer screen right now, you would see that your screen is really just a series of red, blue, and green dots at various levels of brightness. But far enough away, your brain mixes those signals and turns them into the full spectrum of light. Your cones have a one-to-one neural connection, meaning every single cone cell has a dedicated nerve fiber that connects it to your brain. This provides really high-resolution focal acuity. Those pixels, if you will, are really small. These are primarily used during daytime for high-fidelity color vision. The other type of photoreceptor cells are rod cells. You have a lot more of these. There's about 100 million of them versus the 7 million or so cone cells that you have. There's only the one type, but these have about a 10-to-1 connection to the brain. So every 10 or so rod cells are on one bundle that connect to a nerve fiber that run to your brain. That makes those pixels a lot bigger. Your visual acuity from your rod cells is much, much lower. It's about 10-to-1, as you might expect. Now these cells are primarily used for nighttime vision. Because of that 10-to-1 bundling, they require a lot less light to meet the threshold for that nerve fiber to send a signal to your brain and you can see something. Now you don't have the same visual acuity, but in low light you can still see something. And you've probably had this experience being outside or someplace in the dark and you see an object or something over there that you can't really tell what it is, or certainly can't tell what color it is, but you can see that there's something. That's because those rod cells really don't need that much light to give some kind of visual input. You also have a lot more of those rod cells in the peripheral part of your retina. So you might look right at something and it's difficult to see, but if you look away, you still have an idea of where it is and what it's doing. We'll talk a little bit more about that physiological blind spot in a moment. So as I said, you have these two types of rods and cones, but they're not evenly distributed across your eye. The rods have a lot higher concentration at the periphery, whereas your cones are really focused and centered around that central part of your vision, or the fovea. Now when you look directly at something, you're using the fovea. That's that central part of your retina that has a really, really high concentration of cone cells. And so that gives you really high color vision, really high visual acuity for when you're looking directly at something. As an image moves further towards your periphery, there's fewer and fewer cone cells out there, more and more rods, but you can still see that things are there even though you're not looking directly at it. Let's talk briefly about the blind spots of the eye. I already mentioned one. The other one is your anatomical blind spot. And this is caused by that optic disc where there are no cones or rods. Each eye has an anatomical blind spot, but each eye covers the blind spot of the other, which is why we don't typically notice it. The blind spot I already mentioned is the physiological blind spot, and this has to do with the distribution of rods and cones on the back of the eye, and it primarily comes into play during nighttime or low light conditions. So that anatomical blind spot, again, is on that optic disc. With the optic nerve coming in and the blood vessels there in the back of the eye, there are so many other things in that optic disc that there just isn't room for photoreceptor cells. And there aren't any. So that image is still being focused and projected on that spot. There's just no receptors to pick it up. The result is your anatomical blind spot. So let's demonstrate that. Again, just right there at home, reach out with your right hand, make the sign language Y or shaka wave, whichever, and tilt your wrist back so that your knuckles are facing the ceiling. Now I want you to close or cover your left eye, and with your right eye, focus on your thumbnail. Maintaining focus on your thumbnail, rotate your wrist so that your pinky finger comes down around and drops to about the 3 o'clock position. And you will notice that your pinky finger has disappeared. It may take you a few tries to see it, but Each of you has a blind spot somewhere in there, and you can drop that pinky finger down into it. Pretty cool, huh? So that was your anatomical blind spot. Now, do you notice that when you simply close an eye? No. You don't see this big black hole because your brain is just going to fill in that missing information and ignore it. All right, it's like crappy Photoshop, Microsoft Paint with the blur tool. But you aren't actually seeing anything in that spot, and this can present a problem, particularly in the aircraft. There are plenty of objects in that cockpit that can block vision for one of your eyes. Could be your oxygen mask, a canopy rail, the GPS unit that's suction cupped to the window, whatever the case in your cockpit. If there is an object blocking vision of one eye, and you look off to check for another aircraft, a survivor in the water, or any other object that you need to see, if it happens that that object is blocked by something from one eye and it falls into the blind spot of the other eye, you're not going to see it. And this could be a hazard, this could be a problem for your mission. So we need to account for this. And the way we do that is by maintaining a visual scan. It's not enough to just take a single snapshot looking for something and then come back in and look at your gauges or look something else. You need to methodically, consistently move your vision. The recommendation is usually about 10 degrees at a time, so that you can ensure that even if that survivor in the water falls on that blind spot in one look, the next look you will see it. Next, let's talk about the physiological blind spot. We mentioned that distribution of rods and cones across the back of the eye, how they're uneven. Take a look at that graph on the left that shows that distribution. We saw the anatomical blind spot, which is there on the optic disc, but look at the fovea. Huge peak of cones, 0 rods. Well, at night, that can be a problem. At nighttime, when there's very low levels of light, that fovea, or that high concentrated area of cones, is essentially a blind spot. The light coming in isn't at a high enough level to activate those cone cells, so you're not going to see anything. As you move out to the periphery, the light is hitting those rod cells, and you're going to be able to see something. Now, obviously not at the same visual acuity as daytime, but at least you see that something is there. You've probably noticed this when you go out to look at the night sky, and you see a flashing light or a dim set of stars in your peripheral vision, and then you turn your head to look at it, and it disappears. Well, did that light actually go anywhere? Probably not. But because now you're staring directly at it and focusing that light on your fovea, you're not going to be able to pick it up. But you move your eyes away, and it reappears. This again drives the requirement for a scan. Think about the size of an object that can fit into that blind spot. At about 3 feet away, that blind spot's only around an inch across. 30 feet, it's a foot across. The further and further that object gets away from you, the larger it can be and still fall into that blind spot. So if you're just taking a quick snapshot look, something can disappear or be missed because you looked right at it. Could be something as small as a switch. Well, you really might need to find that switch. If you're having an electrical emergency and they're in the aircraft, you look up above you and say, that circuit breaker that I need to pull, I know it's on this panel above my head somewhere, but I can't find it. Well, it turns out you're looking right at it. So you need to move your eyes around and scan, and you may be able to find it. A toolbox at 30 feet, an oil drum or something 100 feet in front of you on the taxiway, a tank, even a large aircraft can fall into that physiological blind spot. So if you just take one look in that direction, you might not see it. But sticking to a methodical scan where you're moving your eyes across that visual field, you're more likely to actually pick up that object once that image is projected onto the periphery of your eye, and those rods can work for you. We're going to shift gears now away from the anatomy of your retina to how your brain processes the visual image coming in. Your central visual field, that fovea, is pretty small, maybe 6 to 8 degrees is what you're really looking at. If you expand that out a little bit, your focal vision is really concerned with about the central 35 degrees of your visual field. Your full visual field is up to 180 degrees per eye, so it's pretty wide. Focal vision is that central 35, the rest is your peripheral vision. And your brain processes these two parts of your vision completely differently. Focal vision is what your brain uses to identify what an object is. It recognizes it, it sees that image, it reaches back into your memory to identify what is that and what do I know about it. Now this is a conscious process. Your brain has to work to make this happen. Right? That focal vision, where all those cones are focused, you get a great deal of detail and high fidelity vision, and that's good to really identify what that object is. Your brain can also use this for distance and depth perception. I know how big that object is, and it's this small in my vision. That tells me it's about this far away. That's just one way that your brain uses that image to identify what something is and gain some pretty specific distance and depth perception and estimation from that image. Peripheral vision is what your brain uses to identify where something is. You may not know what it is, but at least you saw that it was there. Your peripheral vision detected that object, detected that movement, right, and responds to it very quickly. This is a subconscious process, does not require any cognitive work. Right? Now, you don't have really high detail. You may not be able to tell what something is or where exactly it's going, but you know that it's there. And again, this is used primarily for orientation. So if you imagine a sign hanging on the wall, if you look at it with your focal vision, your brain recognizes that shape, that is the letters S, T, O, and P. I know that means stop, and I know what to do. I had to read that, and that was a quick but cognitive process. Now, if I look off to the side and I saw the same sign, right? Now, if it's a red octagon, I have an idea of what that is, but if it was just the word stop, I might know that there was a word on the wall, but I probably can't tell what it is because my brain doesn't process that image that way. So we're going to look at some limitations of your focal and peripheral vision, things that any type of vision really needs to be effective. We're going to talk about visual contrast, the shapes of targets, the movement of targets, and environmental conditions. How many aircraft do you see in this picture? All right, I made it disappear so that you wouldn't have too long. How many did you see? Did you see one? Anybody see two? Maybe even three? Let's look at it again. Definitely see that one on the top. Once those aircraft start moving, that second airplane, if you hadn't seen it, immediately becomes visible. Now, I'm sure some of you saw it the first time, but many of you likely didn't. Why do you think that is? Well, the top one was pretty obvious because it's a white aircraft on a dark background, and there's a very stark visual contrast between the two. The shape of that target was very obvious. And your brain is really good at identifying shapes that stand out, and it draws your vision to it, and it draws that processing to it to figure out, what is this thing that I'm seeing? That bottom aircraft, on the other hand, didn't have that same visual contrast. Now, if I let you look at that picture for a long time, you would have all found it fairly quickly. But in just a few seconds I gave you, many of you didn't see it because you didn't have that visual contrast to make that shape pop. But once it started to move, it became very obvious. Even with minimal contrast, our brains are pretty good at picking up motion in our vision. When that object starts tracking across our visual field, our brain picks it out pretty quickly. In wonderful environmental conditions, this is pretty easy. But in degraded environmental conditions, that contrast, those shapes can be obscured, and even with movement, it might not always be that obvious. So in a moment, we're going to watch a video that makes that clear. This is some real HUD-cam footage from an aircraft operating out west, and I can tell you that there is another aircraft out there somewhere. Now, this is HUD-cam, not what the pilot's actually seeing, but conditions on that day weren't particularly great for visibility, so things are pretty grainy and blurred. Let's see how long it takes you to see the aircraft in this video. So in that previous video, you saw that even though the aircraft was moving very, very quickly, because it was coming directly toward the viewer, it wasn't tracking across your vision, and it made it pretty difficult to see. Also, because of the shape of that aircraft wasn't changing, that aspect was really the same, just a head-on view, there was nothing to catch your eye that something was moving or changing. And it wasn't until the aircraft got very close and suddenly became large in your visual field that you really saw it. Pretty interesting, huh? All right, next I'm going to give you a little bit of a focal vision test. All right. We're going to see if you can tell me what it is that you're seeing. What was that? I'm sure most of you are going to say an airplane. A jet. Okay, good. Was it American? Allied? Hostile? What's its armament? Is it a threat to my mission? Is that somebody I need to rendezvous with or call on the radio? Pretty tough to tell. I'll give you another look at it. Okay, now what is it? Still not sure? Okay, some of you may be able to identify it by now. Some of you maybe not. Make it obvious. How about now? Okay, it's obviously not American. This is an Su-27 flanker. What's its armament? Is this a threat to me? No, it's not a threat. It's just an inflatable. Now, obviously, this is a silly example because an inflatable isn't going to be flying around. However, this does illustrate that limiting the information you have coming in through your eyes doesn't stop your brain from trying to work it into your mental model. Your brain tries to see that object, identify what it is, and start recalling information about it. Now, that's a good feature of our eyes and our brain, but it can get us into trouble when we're in an environment where we either don't see it for very long or the visual environment is degraded so that we don't get a good look at what that is. We might be tempted to write it off as nothing or to make it out to be something that it's not. And in either case, we are now incorporating faulty information into that interior mental model, and we are losing situational awareness. Now let's talk about some focal visual illusions. We'll talk about the absence of focal cues, we'll talk about some runway landing illusions, and then size constancy. The absence of focal cues or reference to the ground can make distance estimation and depth perception very, very difficult, if not completely impossible. We get a lot of information from the ground and the texture of the ground as we see it that we use to estimate how high we are above that ground, how fast we're moving. Well, if we're in an environment where there really aren't very many focal cues, this is really challenging. So if you imagine an environment where the water is glassy smooth, or you're over snow, or perhaps the desert, a place where there just isn't much texture on the ground, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to tell how high I am above that ground. What's the terrain like beneath me? A great example of this that many of you have probably experienced is if you're a skier or a snowboarder, I'm sure you've experienced conditions where a cloud rolls in, it's misty, and it blocks the sun's direct sunlight, and the snow conditions get what they call flat. And what happens when snow conditions get flat? You either slow down and stop, or you end up yard sailing down the mountain because you hit the mogul that was right in front of you. Now, it wasn't that you were skiing with your eyes shut, it's that you couldn't see it because the tiny contrast differences that would normally be present, even though snow is just white, the shadows and texture were no longer visible and you couldn't see it. Well, that same phenomena can affect pilots flying over surfaces like you see described there, because it's impossible to tell how high I am above that object. Take a look at that desert image. Those dark spots across the sand. What are those? Is that some kind of little mossy thing growing on the ground? Or are those groups of trees and bushes? Makes a big difference to tell me how high I am above that surface, but I may not be able to tell. And if I'm not referencing my altimeter because I'm looking outside for orientation, I could get myself into trouble. Now let's look at runway landing illusions. Runway landing illusions come back to the principle that we know what the runway should look like because we have been doing the pattern at this airfield for days and days and days. I've got dozens of landing in this airfield in the last month. I'm pretty good at doing this. I know what the runway should look like, and I'm greasing my numbers. I'm hitting that pattern perfect every single time. So what I've really done is I've learned what that runway is supposed to look like. But if I go to a new runway that has a different slope or a different size than my home runway, it should look different. But if I allow myself to forget about that and try to project what I think the runway should look like during this good approach onto this new runway, I can fall prey to this runway landing illusion. So here's the sight picture at the runway you've been flying on. This is what it looks like as you come in to land on that runway. You're on that good glide slope, and you're good at this, right? You are all going to be the best aviator that ever flew in the sky. I know it. And so you're hitting those numbers every single time. Well, now you're on an approach somewhere else, and you see this. You feel high, right? I feel like I'm above glide slope, so I'm going to correct. What about this? This feels low. I should be seeing more of the runway, and so I need to correct. I need to increase power, increase elevation to get back on glide slope. And that would be true if you were at your home runway. But it could be, in that second example, that it simply is an upsloping runway. So that sight picture you see on the left is correct for your 3-degree glide slope that you're trying to shoot to come in there. Well, if you feel high, you're going to correct by coming down low, and now you're at risk of being too shallow, too low, clipping obstacles, getting below that glide slope, landing short of the runway, all these things that simply occurred because you are too low and didn't realize it. The bottom is just the converse. You feel as though you're low, and so your correction will be to increase power, increase altitude, and the result can be overshooting your runway threshold, landing long, maybe even landing so long that you run out of runway, or at the best case, having to simply go around and do it again, and you're wondering why your approach wasn't very good. Now you can know this by checking the pubs and knowing what that runway is supposed to look like, but if we allow ourselves to get complacent, this can cause us some pretty serious problems. There are many different sloping runways all around the world. These are some extreme examples, as you see here, but even a moderate slope in a runway is going to look different. So we've got to make sure that we're checking our pubs, we're checking our approach plates, especially when we're going to an unfamiliar place, to know what does this runway look like as far as the slope is concerned. The width of the runway can also play a part in this. If I'm landing on a runway that is narrower than the one I'm used to, it's going to look smaller. I'm going to look as though I'm higher above it than I really am. And the tendency on a runway like that is going to be to come in lower than I should. If it's a wider runway, my tendency is going to be that I feel low and I come in higher than I normally would, and I have the same problems as I might with that downsloping runway where I may land long, run out of runway. I'm off my numbers. So a quick look at these runways would maybe make you think that you're at about the same altitude coming into both of them. In reality, you are far off. That runway on the left, I believe I think it's Blacksburg, Virginia. But you're probably at about 400 to 500 feet in that photo. Some of you may recognize the runway on the right. That is the Space Shuttle landing strip at Kennedy Space Center. That runway is enormous. I actually had the privilege to fly a low approach up that runway as a flight student on a cross-country during advanced in the helicopter. And I don't think we ever got below maybe 300 or 400 feet. But it felt like the skids were about to scrape the deck. That runway is just so huge. That picture you see there, that's probably taken from closer to 1,500 or 2,000 feet. And if you look at the area around and the size of the trees, you can pretty quickly identify that. But if you're just focused and looking at that runway, it's pretty difficult to tell. So that video that we just watched is kind of a funny example of the concept of size constancy. You didn't have any trouble believing that that was two normal-sized people going on a ride on two normal-sized motorcycles, until the perspective changed and you saw that those were actually teeny tiny little toys and they were just playing a trick. Well, the reason you thought that is because your brain reaches back in the memory banks, it sees that image and says, that's a motorcycle, and it automatically recalls how big that motorcycle is. There's no reason to expect it to be a toy, so you don't factor that into your calculation. Size constancy is a useful feature. We know that objects don't spontaneously change in size. We perceive an object to have a known fixed size regardless of how big it appears in our visual field. So with those motorcycles, we saw them big in our visual field, and we say, oh, well, they're close to us, and that's not a problem. All right, turns out they were really close to us, and they're actually tiny. A smaller object appears further away, a larger object appears closer, and we can use this for distance estimation. But the actual size of that object has to be known and correct for those cues to be valid. Take a look at this picture of two airliners. Now, on first look, that's pretty strange. Those aircraft look dangerously close together. Well, it turns out they're actually about a mile apart. Those are two airliners landing on parallel runways at a major airport. It's just that white Lufthansa jet is massive in comparison to that United Airlines jet. Now, if you know a lot about airliners and you can easily identify them, that image probably didn't present a big problem for you. It's interesting that they're perfectly aligned with the camera, but no big deal. You know how far those are apart. But if you're not intimately aware of the size of those jets, your initial reaction is pretty strange. What's going on with these aircraft? So think about if you just got a quick snapshot of an airplane as you're out flying around. Maybe it passed through a gap in a couple clouds and you only got a quick look at it. What was that airplane? Was it a giant 777? Was it a 737 that's a lot smaller? Was it a C-130? Maybe a C-12? If you don't get a good look at it, it's very difficult to know how far away that object is from me. Now, if you recognize that you didn't get a very good look at it, you can start looking for other information and factoring that good information into your situational awareness. But if you just take a quick snapshot and assume you know what it is, you may have just incorporated some pretty bad information into your situational awareness, and now you're in trouble. Size constancy plays a part in something else called terrain constancy, and this is basically just that size constancy illusion taking place with objects on the ground. It could be trees, it could be cactus, as in this picture. I use this because I'm not from out west, I'm from Indiana, and so we don't have cactus, and I'm not really familiar with how big they are. I've seen them in pictures, right? They're on the sign at Taco Bell. That's about all I know about cactus. So this cactus is on the hillside, or it's on this ridgeline, and it's passing beneath me. And I may try to use it to judge how high above this ridgeline am I. I'm flying nap of the earth, navigating by sight. What's my altitude right here? Well, to use that cactus, I have to know how big it is. Now, if you would have asked me, boy from Indiana, how big that cactus is, I'd say, yeah, it's probably, 10, 15, maybe 20 feet tall. Seems about right for a big cactus. And you might say the same thing. You would be grossly mistaken. That's a giant saguaro cactus, and they can be 30, 40, even 50 feet tall. Now, if you know that, maybe this is a useful marker for you. If you don't know that, you could be pretty far off. This is just one example of terrain constancy and the trap that it can set as you're flying over terrain that you're not as familiar with as you could be, and you're starting to use objects beneath you for height estimation or depth perception. A normal approach over trees of familiar size looks one way. But if you come to a place where those trees are actually a lot smaller, let's be honest, trees look like trees, whether it's a 20-foot tall fruit tree or a 70-foot tall oak tree. The shape of that tree is about the same. So I could get myself pretty far off of my intended profile if the size of those terrain objects is different and I don't realize it. Here's another example. I'm going to ask you to estimate the size of those trees or bushes. Just right there, that's a great example. Is that a tree or a bush? Well, if there's this little house there in the foreground, well, that's a tree. Those things are monsters. Let's add a little more to the picture. Okay, well, obviously that's a house, and I assume it's a normal-sized house, so those trees are probably maybe 15 feet tall at the most. Turns out that house was actually just a doghouse. Now again, silly example of things disappearing and reappearing, but this does illustrate the point that if you don't have other objects in that image to provide scale, height estimation based on a couple points of data could be faulty. So we avoid this by pre-briefing where we're going. Even if it's a new place, there is information available for what this place looks like, What are the objects around? How tall is that tower? How tall is that building? What are the trees like in this area? Knowing the size and shape of those objects before we go helps a lot. But then finally, the most important is cross-checking your instruments. Even if you are familiar with an area, you always need to keep that scan going and keep coming back to your gauges to ensure you're not off on your numbers, off on your profile. Your gauges aren't going to lie to you. Your brain might. Now let's shift to some peripheral visual illusions. In conditions where you are absent peripheral cues, some pretty powerful illusions can set in that really feel like motion or feel like a lack of motion when that's not the case. We'll also talk about false horizons and vection illusions. So here you're in your aircraft, flying along, and if I were to ask you what attitude of your aircraft is in this picture, you would have no problem telling me that you're flying straight and level. Well, now what's your aircraft doing? Again, pretty easy. We're banking to the left, now we're banking to the right. I don't have to look at my gauges to know that that's the case. But what about now? What's your aircraft doing? You have no way to know. We've blacked out your gauges here in the cockpit, right? So you can't really tell. I've given you a gauge now that shows you that you are straight and level. But the way your brain had to process that information was different from seeing the horizon to seeing that attitude indicator. You're using your focal vision to read that attitude indicator, whereas with the horizon you were using your peripheral vision. You can orient based on focal vision. If you lose view of the horizon, which is a subconscious process, it's very, very fast, when environmental conditions obscure that horizon, whether it's nighttime, you're flying in the clouds, your orientation process becomes conscious, which slows it down. You have now got an extra task that you have to do cognitively, and that is increasing your workload. Now, conditions are fine, no mission is going on, you're just flying from A to B, not a big deal. If you've already got a lot of other mission tasks going, this is one more thing that you've got to juggle and worry about, and it's a pretty important task. And as you've all heard, you keep adding penguins to the iceberg, eventually one of them is going to fall off. So one of the conditions, especially for the folks who go rotary, might encounter is brownout or whiteout. All right, this comes when there's any kind of particulates in the air that blow up and obscure your vision. It could be snow just falling, potentially even rain, but especially in the landing environment, blowing sand or blowing snow from the rotor wash or the downwash from that aircraft, completely obscuring your peripheral vision. This can be a pretty dangerous situation. Now in the next video, you're going to watch 3 different perspectives, 2 outside and 1 from the cockpit, of a V-22 coming into land in a dusty LZ. And I want you to watch and pay specific attention to the bottom frame, where you're going to see what the pilot sees as he comes into land. Now this pilot is on the controls, but he's looking outside for orientation. And the comms are pretty difficult to hear, but you might be able to hear him expressing his confusion, and he actually passes controls to the non-flying pilot. And this is a good thing. That non-flying pilot is looking at the instruments so that when they switch to that inside spatial strategy, that pilot is already on the controls and already on the gauges and using the systems in place to use GPS and other tools to maintain a direct downward flight when the flying pilot becomes disoriented. So take a look. So did you notice in that video how it really looked as though the aircraft was flying backwards really rapidly? Right? That is an example of vection, which we'll talk about in a moment. However, first let's look at the black hole illusion. Black hole illusion is usually going to occur in an environment where there is total darkness, potentially in cases of fog or mist or obscuration, where the only visual cues are the runway lights. And this could be a few lineup lights for a runway, but in the maritime environment, this could be the single stern light or the couple tail lights of that aircraft carrier or destroyer or cruiser, depending on which aircraft and platform you're flying on. So it's common over water, or it could be in a remote area far away from cultural lighting, a runway out in the middle of nowhere, perhaps a really large military base where you might be near a city, but below a certain altitude you can't really see those city lights and you're just down over this widespread area of blackness of that base land. In the black hole illusion, it's common to perceive that the runway is moving. So remember what's happened. You've lost peripheral view of that horizon or any other references outside. All you have is this tiny point or couple points of light that are in front of you. Well, when we have peripheral view of the horizon, if our whole visual field moves, we know that the planet isn't suddenly shifting and tilting. So we immediately know and interpret that it's us that's moving. But when I'm focusing on a single point of light out ahead of me, my brain doesn't naturally jump to, that is stable, I must be moving. It's actually the opposite. The runway seems like it's moving. The runway seems like it's out of position. Well, what's really moving? Me and my aircraft. But that's not visually obvious in these conditions. A lot of times it'll appear that the runway is closer than it is. I could still be very far away from that runway, but because that's the only light in this sea of black, the contrast is pretty high, which normally means that I'm close to that light source. So this can also cause distance estimation issues. So I feel like I'm close. I feel like I should be coming down now because I'm about to land, when I'm really not that close, and now I'm descending below glide slope. So the result of the black hole illusion is that pilots tend to fly fast and below glide slope and potentially land short or even crash into some obstacle well short of the runway because they're keeping that object in their center of their visual field and not picking up this descent rate. Right? When you approach a runway, that runway light should drop in your visual field and eventually pass under the nose of your aircraft. But the tendency in these conditions is to keep that single point of light in view and not realize that that is resulting in a descent below glide slope. And so it's called the black hole illusion because it's almost as though your aircraft is being sucked down into the darkness without you realizing it. So this image is of an aircraft flying along over a cloud deck. So the aircraft looks like it's approximately level, right? Wrong. Our brain is naturally going to reach out for any relatively horizontal line that we see in our visual field and potentially treat that as the horizon. Remember, we're hardwired to orient based on the Earth's surface. So that horizontal line looks as good as any other, so I must be wings level. Problem is there are a lot of horizontal lines in the flight environment that aren't actually level with the horizon. It could be cloud decks. It could be roads, particularly at nighttime. When I'm in the dark and there's all this darkness, the sky is dark, the land is dark, and then there's this long, relatively horizontal line of lights. Now, if I'm flying along, not a lot's going on in my cockpit, I can see that, and I know that that's not level. That's I-10. However, as soon as something else comes in to capture my attention or demand my brain to think about other things, I push that orientation task off to the side a little bit. My brain is naturally going to have a possibility of grabbing that line as a horizon. It could be a road, maybe a coastline where the sky is dark, the water is dark, and then I've got this long line of white sand. It could easily look like a horizon. Maybe a ridge line with some lights or contrast, cultural lighting. Any of these things, when they present a strong, relatively horizontal cue, could be bought off on by my brain as a false horizon. Again, you have an instrument in your cockpit that tells you what's level. Even in easy conditions, easy flying conditions, good visual conditions, you should always be coming back to cross-check those instruments. Next, let's talk about vection. Vection is a false sense of motion due to movement of the peripheral field, especially when my entire peripheral field is moving in some way. I will feel as though I am moving. There are 3 categories of vection: linear, angular, and concentric, and we'll talk about each of them. Linear vection is a false sense of linear motion. You've all experienced this sitting at the stoplight and you're looking down at the radio or your phone or something like that, and then all of a sudden your car starts rolling backwards and you slam on the brakes. And then you feel silly because it was actually just a big panel van that was in the lane next to you and they started to pull forward and it just felt as though you were moving backwards. Right? And your wife is looking at you like you're a crazy person. Right? But it really felt like we were rolling backwards. That's because your entire peripheral view was all moving together, and our brain is hardwired to translate the peripheral movement of our entire visual field as our movement. So this can happen when a car rolls next to you at the stoplight. This can happen in formation flying, where a large portion of your peripheral visual field moves together. The next type of vection is angular vection. This is where your peripheral field is spinning around a point, and it makes you feel as though you are the one spinning. Some common examples of this are the disco ball at your middle school dance, right? They just hang this goofy mirrored ball up at the top, shine a light on it, and when they turn the lights out, there's all these points of light swirling around the room, and it feels like we are all spinning to the teeny bopper tunes that we're doing our slow dance to. Planetariums do this. In flight, the anti-collision lights, especially from a rotor wing aircraft in the clouds, can do this as that rotor head spins and you're just getting this quick snapshot of these spinning lights as it flashes. That can impart a feeling of rotation or spinning because of angular vection. Finally, concentric vection. This is primarily a phenomenon that affects rotary wing pilots and aircrew. The rotor wash, the downwash from that aircraft, is going to create wavelets that push outwards, or dust that moves outwards away from the center of that downwash. Well, those concentric circles can make it appear as though the aircraft is descending or approaching the ground. It creates this illusion of movement. So this is how George Lucas was taking audiences to hyperspeed back in the 70s. It was just taking little points of light and shooting them towards the outside of the movie screen, and it really felt on that big screen as though we were all going to hyperspeed. That's concentric vection. In the aircraft, I've had several occasions where my crewman in the back, looking down at the hoist or whatever they're doing below the aircraft, calls out on the ICS and says, "Hey sir, watch your descent." I check my altimeter and see we're not descending. Right? But to him, looking down at the water and seeing all those wavelets moving out away from that central point, there is a strong illusion of concentric vection and it feels like we're descending. So let's quickly review these visual illusions we've discussed so far. So what are some of the causes of those focal illusions? Well, we talked about absent focal cues, where there's just not much texture to the ground to see anything useful. There's the runway landing illusions due to slope or width. And then there's size constancy. Remember, I have to actually know how big that object is to really be able to interpret useful information about its distance from me or its movement. Which is the visual illusion that can result from aligning yourself with the strongest horizontal peripheral cue? Yeah, a false horizon. My brain bites off on that relatively horizontal line and treats it like the horizon when that isn't the case. I can be in big trouble. Finally, what are those 3 types of vection illusions? All right, linear, angular, and concentric. All right. You see there in that picture by Hank Caruso, the famous aerocatures artist. All right, you got this helicopter, and he's seeing those wavelets moving. All right, so if you imagine, that pilot would be feeling as though he was flying backwards because those wavelets, coming from the rotor wash, which was concentric, but as the pilot up front is looking down, those waves are all moving in one direction. That would be a sense of linear vection, feeling as though the aircraft is drifting backwards, and so the tendency is going to be to respond and creep forwards, and you can see in this picture they are impacting the side of the ship. So let's take a break. We've reached the end of part 1. Thank you all for your attention. I strongly recommend you stand up, take a break, do a couple jumping jacks, walk around your house a little bit, something like that. always practicing social distancing, and we'll see you back here for part 2 shortly.